Hi, I'm Tom Montgomery Fate and I teach creative writing here at College of DuPage. Today I'll be talking with a Chicago writer who is also a former COD student, Michael Burke. After Michael reads Things That Matter, we'll talk more about where those stories came from and about his creative process.
Barbara. Sometimes I think she's nothing but red lipstick and turtleneck sweaters. Comes charging toward us, smiling, laughing, careful not to spill a drop of Merlot from her big wine glass. No, 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 she says. No talking about movies. Movies are what people talk about when they have nothing else to say. Bernie says movies are safe. You can disagree, he explains, and not really hurt the other person's feelings. Barbara downs another sip of wine while shaking her head with measured finality. No, she declares, this weekend we can only talk about things that matter. She dashes off into the big kitchen calling for my wife, Claire. That leaves Bernie and me trying to change the subject. Books, I suggest? That can get too personal, he says. The cost of housing. He considers, but shakes his head after a thoughtful moment. Thoughtful moments are Bernie's specialty. He's a psychotherapist. A just dawned on me smile appears from within his short black beard and makes his balding head wrinkle. Dogs, he says. I grew up with a good old German shepherd. Now we've got a dachshund. Bernie, I say, is this a subject that really matters? We laugh together. This is a weekend intended for laughter. 3 couples, longtime friends, gathering on an always cold, always snowy January weekend to celebrate Barbara's birthday. But the rule is, we can't ever mention Barbara's birthday. Barbara is big on rules. Don't ever mention my birthday. Only talk about things that matter. But we all love her anyway. And we all love this house, too. Barbara and Bernie's 2-story, 4-bedroom getaway on the shores of Lake Michigan and Union Pier. The tall living room windows overlooking Whitecaps and ice, the wood fireplace snapping with occasional yellow sparks, the woven rugs and polished oak floors. Claire is in the kitchen with Laura, preparing supper, both of them now trying to convince Barbara that they've got dinner well under control. Will, Laura's skinny husband, is smoking and shivering on the outside deck. The woman's laughter rises in the kitchen. I particularly hear Claire's rather high, somewhat startling guffaw when I realize I haven't been listening to a single word that Bernie has been saying. Noise in Calcutta is where I pick it up, but that wouldn't discourage us. I give him what I hope appears to be a confirming nod and grunt, then try to look surprised at discovering the sudden emptiness of my wine glass. Hey, Bernie, I say, I need a refill. You? He considers, thoughtfully, then shakes his head. Claire, Laura, and Barbara are friends from way back, high school and college. I always forget which 2 were friends first and who disliked the other early on. Maybe because when the subject comes up, they themselves don't seem to agree, and they all 3 talk at once. Barbara and Bernie have been models of a sort for Claire and me. They are a couple who seem made for one another, clearly affectionate, endlessly curious about what the other might have to say, particularly playful with their 2 small boys, who on this weekend always stay with their wiener dog at Bernie's parents' home in the city. You don't think Barbara and Bernie have problems, Claire has said to me more than once, as we've lain awake talking in our beds here and at home. Claire loves conversation, day or night. She produces a public radio talk show. You always idealize Ben. They're only human. Then why have you started dressing like Barbara? Because let's just get some sleep. Laura and Will have been models of a different sort. The last of the 3 pairs to marry, and the first to display their difficulties in public, Laura and Will always have been the couple in trouble, the couple I worry about, the couple I fear we might become. Do you hear us, I have said more than once in the midst of a disagreement with Claire. We're beginning to sound like Laura and Will. Claire usually frowns when I say this. I think she knows it's true. Laura co-owns an antique shop in Winnetka, a hand-me-down from her serious parents that she runs with her youngest sister because she can't stand talking to customers. Will is an audiologist. Their daughter Bethany goes to preschool with our son Adam. Are we close to actually eating? I'm sticking my head inside the swinging kitchen door, wondering if I've just maybe overheard something I shouldn't. The only word I heard clearly was communion. The wives are all bent over, with the remnant gestures of a good, hard laugh, each of them holding a swaying wine glass by the fingertips. Claire smiles, snaps to attention, and says, "Oops," as if she's just been caught. That makes Laura laugh even harder. Barbara steps forward and raises an eyebrow. "Yes," she says. "Benjamin, yes. Dinner is indeed at hand." I raise an eyebrow as well. "I'll get Will," I say, starting my retreat from the doorway. "Oh," Laura says, the thin smile sharpening into a sharp grimace on her long face. "Do let my husband smoke." Smoking is something new for Will. And what's more, he's smoking cigars. "I see," I say, and the women laugh with me, though this time much of our laughter is uneasy. "I'm only kidding," Laura adds, quickly before I let the swinging door close behind me. "Only kidding. You better retrieve him before the frostbite really sets in." Claire and I have spent some time, probably too much time, speculating about the source of Laura and Will's troubles. I have observed that, well, Laura does have that edge, and Claire has insisted that Will is the textbook profile to have an affair. But the evidence of our lives together at dinners, movies, preschool meetings, and getaway weekends has consistently proven Laura's generosity and has never suggested that Will has been anything but faithful. This past Thanksgiving, we thought maybe things would change, soften between them. That was when Will was diagnosed with tumors. "How bad is it?" I asked later, over the phone in mid-December, a hand cupped to my other ear because carolers were singing at our front door. "Let's put it this way," Will replied. "Nobody's rushing to sell me insurance." During these past few weeks, however, things have not mellowed between Laura and Will. Sometimes, Bernie explained in a different phone conversation on a quieter day, illness only makes people more like themselves. And so it has with Laura and Will. Sarcasm, a bad habit that launched their marriage, now seems to fuel a bad habit that launched their romance, now seems to fuel their marriage. "Let's face it," Will told me a few days after our phone conversation, "this has always just been a dress rehearsal for Laura's second marriage." "Will," I replied, but really didn't know what else to say. Eventually, I changed the subject and asked if he thought taking up smoking at a time like this was a wise idea. He shrugged. This weekend in Michigan, then, seems much like the others. Laura and Will sniping at one another, Barbara setting rules and Bernie pouring wine, Claire and me swapping behind their back looks from time to time. But there is a difference. This weekend, of course, there is new and uncomfortable knowledge underneath all we say and do. There is the fact, unrecognized until now, that this sort of gathering cannot, will not, go on forever. It is something we don't discuss. Dinner is superb. Stuffed Cornish hens, brown rice, green beans, and white wine. While we eat, Barbara commands the conversation, moving us along from subject to subject with laughter, and when a topic like boxing arises, saying, "Oh, please, no, let's talk about anything else," her authority in having the final word. Barbara volunteers at the Art Institute as a foreign language interpreter, so we spend some time discussing the new exhibit on Van Gogh. Then the performance of our stocks and the diversity of our portfolios. Then who is and who might be running in our state's gubernatorial race. We speak quickly, words falling upon other words, but certain words are never mentioned. Will is quiet throughout all of this, his slim shoulders somewhat slumped, his brown eyes forward as he picks at his food. Near the end of the meal, about the time I have placed my silverware on my plate and am taking a final taste of another glass of wine, I look at Claire and catch her yawning and wonder. Then Will speaks. "I've got a story," he says. "Maybe you'd all like to hear it?" The table is suddenly quiet until Laura says, in a voice deliberately too eager, "Oh, yes." Will sits back in his chair but keeps his eyes on the table as if he hasn't heard Laura speak. "A summer afternoon," he says, "a beach not far from here. A young woman and a young man wearing black swimsuits and sunglasses. They are stretched out on twin beach chairs. They have been outside sunning for a while now, so they're slightly red and sweaty. From time to time, the woman rises and walks the few yards to the lake. She cools her feet on the barest of waves, using one raised hand to shield her face from the glare of the sun as she tries in vain to see the distant city all the way across the great lake. The man smiles as he watches her, and then, as if she feels him smiling, the woman turns her head to see, and she smiles too. "I could live here forever," she says. Not another soul is on the beach. It's a weekday, and unlike the weekends on this particular stretch of sandy beach, this woman and this man are quite alone except for each other, that is. After another look across the dark blue lake, after taking a lengthy scan of the baby blue sky swept with streaky white clouds, after sighing and stretching and saying it once again, "Forever," the woman returns to the beach chair and sits beside the man. The man gives her a moment to get settled, get comfortable. Then he slowly reaches across the few inches of sand that separates the two of them, and he takes her hand in his. She smiles again, and he smiles too, because for now, he still believes in forever. No one at the table says a word. Laura brings the white cloth napkin to her eyes. Barbara looks at Laura. Bernie looks at Will. Claire clutches my hand, her fingernails tight into my skin. Will looks up. He's smiling. "And Barbara," he says, "I've been meaning to tell you, happy birthday."
So welcome to COD, Michael. I really appreciate you taking the time to come and join us for a while.
I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you for having me.
And so you've just read two of your stories that are from your forthcoming collection. One that appeared in Eulogy appeared in the Troy Quarterly, correct?
Correct.
A very prestigious journal from Northwestern University, and the other one was from American
Way,
the magazine of American Airlines. So, if we could, I'd like to start by asking, where did those stories come from? Maybe we could start with Eulogy, which is not a very happy story.
It's not a happy story. In my defense, I'll quote the great Henry James, who noted that the happiest writers write the darkest stories. Eulogy I actually wrote here at College of DuPage. I was in an English class, and I had set off to write a story that was very different than the story I'd written just prior to it. The story I'd written just prior to it was a very sort of loving, tender, bittersweet story.
Happy ending.
Happy ending, sort of a warm tale. And that story is titled Together, and it made the point that we're all in this, we're all in life together. And with Eulogy, I set out to write a story that I hope would make the same point, that togetherness is important, and that by being alone and being fiercely alone, it leads to bad things. But I tried to write it with exactly that tone, a darker, more empty tone.
Yeah, because there's clearly this sense of the inadequacy of love, like there is, or it's almost like there is sex, but there's no love.
Right.
And this sense of isolation in a quote-unquote successful American family in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Is that?
It's very much aiming at that. If you go back and the students may be interested in reading, or maybe they've already read William Faulkner's Nobel Prize acceptance speech. Mm-hmm. But in that speech, which is a great sort of call to arms for writers and artists, he talks about grieving on no universal bones, leaving no scars, and talks about these situations in life that can be really tough situations and can be really dark times. And what is the writer's job in reflecting on those situations. And what I tried to do with Eulogy was to do sort of a no-holds-barred look at the lives of these characters who ostensibly were leading happy lives, but really when you looked more emotionally what was going on inside, there was a lot at work there.
Yeah. And the other thing I was curious about, there's not a clear sense of resolution in either of these stories. I guess you might call them an open ending. Is that typical with your work, or do you agree that they're kind of open endings, kind of an invitation for the reader to insert their own interpretation?
Yeah, and that seems to be a characteristic of my writing. I used to wonder whether it was a weakness of my writing, whether I was just weak on endings. And I do think it's the ending that makes or breaks a short story ultimately. It'll leave the reader with that sense of satisfaction or dissatisfaction. And I tend to hit these sort of ambiguous tones in my stories. I sometimes use the frame of thinking that there are 4 different types of endings. Much as there's 4 different types of endings in real life, we have 4 different types of endings in stories. There's victory, ending in a victory, a story that ends in defeat, a story that ends in surrender, or a story that ends in a sort of stalemate. And I think with both of these stories, it's probably not clear-cut one of those, but it's probably somewhere between stalemate and defeat, or stalemate and surrender. There's a measuredness to it.
Yeah. And another question. When I started out writing, and I think a lot of young writers, we get exercises and assignments, and we're trying to move toward writing a full-blown short story. But oftentimes, what we end up writing are scenes or character sketches. And I wondered if you had any thoughts. Like, these are really short stories, yet they're also definitely stories. How does one move from like a scene or a sketch to a story? Or any thoughts on that?
It's a great question. The first is to be, I think the first step is to be really cognizant of something I'm sure everybody's heard, but it's so true. A story needs a beginning, a middle, and an end. And when I've been in classes, you do hear a lot of good beginnings. But how do you get to that middle? How do you get to that end? There's a couple of formulas that can be used to help move that along. One comes from the great playwright David Mamet, who has said, every play should answer 3 questions. Every story should answer 3 questions. Who wants what from whom? What happens when they don't get it? And why now? What's the urgency of the moment? Why is today different than any other day in these characters' lives? And I think if a writer is working on a story and you sort of get to that point where you're sort of stuck, or you feel like you've petered out, you've had a very good beginning, going back to that character, and the characters you've created, and thinking about what is it they want, why can't they get it, and what's the urgency of the moment. And that is a way that I have found to help me move a story along. Another piece of advice comes from a terrific writer I heard speak here at College of DuPage, a writer named Janet DeSaulniers.
Oh, yeah.
And she gave some great advice that has stayed with me, and that is, your secrets will make your best stories.
Yeah.
So I think that's worth thinking about too. What is it that you sort of hold as the little secrets in your life? A secret thought, a secret worry, a secret concern, a secret joy, a secret happiness. And write about those moments and transfer them to the characters that you're writing about.
That's helpful. I had her as a teacher years ago, and I'll never forget her talking about when you first start to read a short story, it's like walking into a movie theater, and the lights go down low. And in the best stories, you never lose focus on the screen. The lights, when stories aren't working, it's like the lights come on in the middle of the show. I thought that was a good metaphor.
Yeah, that is
helpful. So back to the two stories you read. This is a common question, but are they autobiographical? Do you draw on your experience in the middle of the Middle West or Southwest Michigan? Or, I mean, it sounds like your stories are more character-driven generally.
Mm-hmm.
And then do you imagine the plot, or how do you work? How do you?
I typically don't start with autobiography and move to fiction. But that's perhaps an inadequate answer, because the truth is there is a emotional truth that every story has. There is what Eudora Welty referred to as the feeling of a story. And that emotion that is within that story comes from the writer. And so I think I'm bringing my emotional framework to both of the stories I read, to every story I write. And within that are some layers of autobiography, because it's my life, my experiences that I've brought to it. But in neither of these stories did these weekends occur, or did these events occur. Mm-hmm. Now that said, both stories contain little snippets of dialogue that I've either heard or have been expressed to me over the years, and I'll make a jot in a journal and lift that and use that for something just right that the character might say at that time, mm-hmm. Or an expression, but not, it's not as if I'm thinking, okay, boy, that summer in Rome was the best summer of my life. I'm going to turn that into a story. That's at least not the way I approach my fiction, although it's a way that other writers do, and it works quite successfully for them.
Yeah. So do you, in terms of your own practice and your own discipline, are you someone who has a particular time of day, a particular flavor of tea, a particular room, or are you, how do you work?
If only it were so. I have grown less disciplined as I've grown older, and I think the habits of writing were more important to me when I was first starting off as a writer, and I found them really helpful. It was sort of like, you might approach a workout or a diet, though far be it from me to talk about diets, where you've got that sort of discipline of, I'm going to write, I'm going to read, but as I've gotten older, I find, with the pressures of life and less time, I'm still reading frequently and writing frequently, but I don't have those sort of structures of a regular time or place. And in many ways, that has been very freeing for me. I'm on the road a lot, and I can write. The good news is I can write wherever I'm at.
Mm-hmm. You've also written a number of plays, had a number of plays produced. Mm-hmm. You like poetry, maybe particularly as a playwright and writing a short story. How does writing for the stage opposed to writing for the page? Do you have any thoughts about the differences between those, or how those two kinds of writing inform each other for you?
It's a great question. When I get the first flash of inspiration, and typically for me that is either an image or something I imagine hearing a character say. So it's either the image, for instance, in Things That Matter. The first inspiration was husband and wife in black swimsuits on a beach, that sort of speck of an image, and then this image of Barbara charging toward me. And I typically start off with a flash of inspiration with that, and I know instantaneously, sort of instinctively, whether this is a poem, whether it's a story, or whether it's a play. Now, how I know that, I'm not sure, but I imagine it's part of the process of spending a great deal of my life reading a lot of poems, reading a lot of short stories, reading a lot of plays, and there's some part of my subconscious process that brings that up with the inspiration. What I found really helpful about playwriting in particular is that there's an enforced structure with writing a 2-act play, for instance. a full evening 2-act play. You've got some structures on time lengths, and you've got other structures on very much being aware that you're trying to hold intense attention of a playgoer for 90 minutes or 2 hours. And I found that that kind of rigor helped me in two ways. It helped me sharpen my writing even more, so that to really look at where is there waste in sentences or waste in paragraphs. But also it opened my mind up to the structure of storytelling. And going back to the good question you asked before about plot, in the structure of a play, there's a very different middle, beginning, and an end than you have in a short story, especially if you have an intermission, because you've got sort of a beginning, middle, and end in the first act, and you have to have a really strong, what a prose writer would say is a page turner at the end of the close of the first act to make sure the audience comes back to the intermission. And then you've got to continue to build by starting again in the second half. So it's great to work in these different forms and to study their different demands and structures.
A final question, just to follow up with that. So there's very little exposition in neither of these stories. Again, I haven't read all of your work, but very little exposition in these stories. Very strong dialogue, and all the characterization is through action. So do you think that's partly from your background as a playwright too? Because that's another thing that students struggle with, is not to explain everything in terms of the character detail and how they characterize.
I think it does come from playwriting. I think it also comes from the writers I was most drawn to early on too. And if you look at, I was drawn to early on Ernest Hemingway and more recently Raymond Carver. These are writers who are very much writing in that vein. Now, Hemingway, of course, does have work that's more expansive than what one might know just from his hard-boiled short stories. But I think it was influenced by playwriting. I think it's influenced by what I've read, and it's probably also just influenced by what I bring to my own writing. And that's the great thing about writing and writers and reading, is that each of us have our own individual voice and have our own individual stories to tell. And they're stories that only we can tell.
Yeah, that's a nice note to end on. Thanks again, Michael Burke. Glad you could visit.
Thank you.